Welcome to the D6 Family Ministry Podcast, a place where ideas, principles, and personalities come together to give you a ministry advantage that empowers the church and home.
I don't know anything more important in our society or in the kingdom of God than to help the church, help the family.
Discipleship is not an event, it's a way of life.
And one day it just hit me that discipleship at home was not about doing more. It was about inviting Christ into what we were already doing.
The goal of family ministry is not families sitting on the couch holding hands and singing Kumbaya. The ultimate goal is families that love God, love people, and make disciples of all peoples.
So that's why you're here. You're here to say 1 hour a week, as significant and as awesome as it is, we know that it's not enough and we want to be intentional with every hour.
You're listening to the D6 Podcast. Here are your hosts, Marianne Howard, Ron Hunter, and Josh Wooten.
Well, Jay Strother, one of our favorites to be challenged by, is our guest today. And he shares that he is a avid coffee drinker, kind of a bougie coffee drinker from what I gather. And so I thought we should discuss our coffee habits.
You know, I think if I were able to drink coffee in the places he talks about in this interview, I think I would learn to drink it the way he does. But
yes,
he called what I do in drinking coffee an abomination.
He did.
He did.
He straight called us out.
You know, I always say I drink sissy coffee, I guess, but, you know, girly coffee, whatever it is, I got lots of sugar and cream in mine. I like a little bit of coffee with my cream. But, you know, he says he likes it just bold and straight and rich and dark. Anyway, the opening of my book, you probably know this from the DNA of D6, the very first chapter opens up. I order my coffee from Starbucks is a 7-pump white mocha, venti 7-pump white mocha. And I say right there in parentheses, don't judge me, because I'm putting in 2 extra pumps of sweetener and that white chocolate. I like my coffee sweet.
Yes.
How do you drink your coffee? What are you? Can you do it without sugar and cream?
No. Now I'm married to a man that's similar to Jay. He likes that coffee straight squeezed from the bean. We call it bean sweat around here.
Oh my goodness. Your husband and Pam and our son would get along so well. My son, he did not drink coffee a day in his life. And then he went on a mission trip to Cuba and came back drinking Cuban coffee, straight black.
Wow.
He's never looked back.
Wow.
I wish I was as manly as Chad and Michael and Jay, but I'm not. I got to have some sugar and cream with my coffee. It just won't work.
I do half and half, and I do 2 spoonsful of sugar. Helps the medicine go down.
Oh my goodness. That's hilarious.
2 spoonfuls of sugar and half and half. And I like the Land O'Lakes half and half. And I'm telling you what, I long for my cup of coffee every morning. Sometimes, depending on the season, I'll run a decaf in the afternoon, probably around 2 or 3 o'clock. That's when I try to crash. But I love my coffee.
I am not a morning coffee drinker. I like to drink a cup around 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So in fact, I'm ready for a cup about now, because this is when we're recording this podcast, and I will probably get one afterwards. But yeah, and by the way, I was just reminded, for those of you who are coffee drinkers, I had a friend of mine. He is now no longer living. Cancer took him at a little bit earlier age than it should have been. But he wrote an interesting book on coffee from a gospel narrative, and it's called The Secret Blend by Stan Toller. And really, really enjoyed reading that book. I learned more about coffee than I ever wanted to know. And it was about the gospel and coffee. And that sounds like a weird mix, but, you know, I would encourage you to go out and pick that one up. We didn't publish this. I forget who did, but I read that book about 20 years ago or 15 years ago from him. But our guest has written more than one book, or contributed to writing more than one book. He wrote a book with Timothy Paul Jones on Perspectives of Family Ministry several years ago. It has been recently re-released. and would highly recommend you picking up that book. Timothy Paul Jones, Jay Strother, Kevin Jones, and a couple more. Forgive me for the authors who I'm overlooking. But he also wrote a contributing chapter to Recalibrate, which was our theme book for D6 2019, where we had 15 different authors bring their wealth of experience and insight, and each one brought their expertise on a specific area of family ministry. And Jay, I asked him to write on young adults, which is often the age group that people believe does not fit the narrative of family ministry. And that's going to be his topic today. He's going to challenge the church to make sure that gap is not overlooked and give us some really practical ways for understanding and helping them. How is your church doing on this front, Marianne?
I definitely think that I was super inspired by just his conversation at the D6 conference this year. We came away with lots of challenges and questions, and our church is actually filled with this age group. And so making sure that we are being intentional, and, the availability that they have in that stage can be overlooked. Yeah. And so I'm excited for you guys to hear what he has to say. I think you're going to walk away with a lot of practical tips and helps and strategies. And just, if anything else, when you step foot into your church building this coming week, it opens your eyes to a new space, that there would just be new awareness for, what we're doing with young adults and, empowering them and discipling them. And I'm excited to share when we come back, just something that happened kind of through his D6 talk, very similar to what he's talking about in our podcast. But there's something that happened in my life, and I can't wait to share it with you on the other side of this conversation.
Good deal. Well, let's take a break and listen to Jay Strother.
Splink is a simple way to help families in your church link together spiritually. It comes as a free weekly email with ideas that parents can use to have fun, make memories, and talk with their kids. Those teachable moments give moms and dads opportunity to share spiritual truths and life lessons. And no matter how busy life is, there's always time to Splink. Share d6family.com with the parents in your ministry so they can sign up today to start receiving free weekly Splink.
Jay Strother is the lead campus pastor of the church at Station Hill, a regional campus of Brentwood Baptist Church. He's the author of Loving Well and a contributing author to both Recalibrate and Perspectives on Family Ministry. Jay and his wife have 3 daughters and 1 son, and they serve as host home families, and they serve as a host home for safe families. Jay is a fan of strong coffee, and he is also a St. Louis Cardinals baseball fan, which is near and dear to my heart. Jay, thanks for being here.
Yeah, so glad to be here with you guys.
Well, I would love to talk to you about the Cardinals for the next 20 minutes, right. But I would probably lose my job over that, and we would also lose all the fans out in Chicago.
We'll start another podcast.
We will, yes. And we could just alienate those people. But we are talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. We're talking about young adults, and we're talking about how they are not the gap into adulthood. As someone that works on young adult curriculum, as someone who is coming to terms that he's just leaving the young adult age, that's kind of been tough. This is a topic that I really am passionate about. I serve in my local church in young adult ministry, and my heart has been there. And so it makes me so happy to see you addressing this and talking about this, because I think churches need this. I was reading your chapter in the book Recalibrate, and your chapter is called Young Adults Are Not the Gap into Adulthood. And in the opening lines, you say, most churches treat young adults as an afterthought. Why is that happening right now? Why have young adults become an afterthought in the church?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that are taking place in the church. One is that we are dealing with the aftermath of the very hyper-focused, programmatic, age-graded ministries. And so we really were passionate, a generation ago about we've got to be sure we have young people in church. So very well-intentioned, right? But we crafted these age-segregated ministry models. And the problem was we didn't give much thought to what happens after high school. And so as a lot of research has pointed to, unfortunately, when a lot of our young people graduated from high school, they also graduated from church, so to speak, because they didn't know how to interact with the larger church, an intergenerational church as a whole. And so the assumption, of course, there was always, well, they'll come back when they get married and start having kids. And that we've learned that's a dangerous assumption to make.
Yeah, and I want to go to that real quick because we hear these grim statistics about young adults leaving the church after high school. And when I was working at a church, there was a group of parents who just told me, they're like, we're not worried about our kids. Yeah, sure, they're not in church right now in their college years, and sure, they're out doing all this stuff, but they're going to come back because they always come back. What are you seeing, and what is research telling us about will they come back? Do they come back? What are we looking at right now?
Yeah. Research is showing that, unfortunately, that's a dangerous assumption to make. There are a couple of things that are contributing to it. One is the way that our culture is structured. It's taking longer for people to get that higher education. A lot of jobs presume now a master's degree. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I quoted, in the main session today was that the average age for somebody getting married in the 1950s was 21. That age is now 28. So it's 27 for females, 29 for guys. So that means you have this multiple year gap in which, all kinds of life experiences are happening that by and large are pulling people away from kind of traditional participation in church activities. And the reality is this generation is so connected, they're so creative, they're so innovative that they are finding if churches don't have a place for me, well, then I'm going to go invest in other places that will value my contributions. And so they're getting involved, in serving, they're getting involved in volunteerism, in other sectors of society. And so, on the positive sense, they have a real desire to make a difference. But unfortunately, in most churches, their leadership structures, the way we do church hasn't adapted in order to engage the young adult population.
So it kind of sounds like you're saying the desire to serve is there, but they're just not finding a good place to do
absolutely, it. Yeah. There's all these stereotypes about, millennials in particular right now is the predominant generation. We're almost on the verge of Gen Z, right? They're about 18, 19, 20 years old right now, moving into that young adult population, but we're still in the millennial phase. And so those millennials, there's these stereotypes about them. The previous generations on surveys, it shows that the key words that people think of when they think of millennials are entitled and lazy and irresponsible. But millennials themselves view themselves as creative, as innovative, as passionate. So there's this huge disconnect between what the perception is and honestly what the reality is. So in some ways, millennials get a bad rap. Our young adults get an unfair rap because let's be honest, it's a hard world to be an emerging adult right now. Globalization has changed the economy and the workforce. Again, the pressure on relationships has changed dramatically. And so, if we're not careful, we begin to play into the stereotype instead of seeing them as young adults who have something to contribute to not just society, but specifically to the church. And think about it. In most church structures that your elders, your decision makers, your pastoral staff, very few times do we listen or engage young adults in the process of leadership in our church. But at the same time, these are the same young adults who, if they see a problem in the world, well, they're going to come up with an innovative solution. They're going to go fund it on Kickstarter. They're going to build a website. They're going to network through social media, and they're going to rally their peers around it. And they're doing some pretty innovative and creative things, but we're not harnessing that in the local church.
Yeah, and I'm glad you kind of squashed some of those stereotypes because sometimes we can sometimes form our ministry mindedness around those stereotypes, and it excludes the millennials and the young adults from it because we assume certain things about them that aren't necessarily true.
And man, one key thing I've learned planning a church, I've learned in a lot of ways is don't assume. As a matter of fact, a lot of the research on millennials is pretty stunning, in the sense that they haven't really rejected the values of the previous generation. What they've rejected is the way that the previous generation went about trying to achieve and satisfy themselves, in the sense of boomers and Gen X kind of made life about accumulation. Instead, what the millennials are wanting to do is they want to accumulate, but not things, experiences. So they see the key as a holistic, well-being. That's what they're really looking for, and research bears that out. And so what's interesting is they're not rejecting the values of the previous generation, but they're looking at that previous generation and seeing that the broken marriages, the broken families, the stressed out, anxious, burned out, on all kinds of medication kind of generation. Yeah. Why? Because they were trying to climb the ladder all the time. And so they're rejecting the process, the way they got there. They're saying there has to be a better way. Although they're very much about accomplishing a lot of the same goals and being world changers as some of the previous generations.
Well, I want to talk about something that it kind of struck me in your chapter when I read it in Recalibrate. And I was kind of like, okay, wait a second, what? And I had to go back and read it again.
Sure.
In the book, you talk about ways the church can recalibrate to a new norm when it comes to young adult ministry.
Yeah.
And in your first point, you encourage churches to cultivate a disciple-making culture that elevates but doesn't idolize families. Now, when we talk about family ministry, we don't often talk about the danger of idolizing families. Can you unpack that a little bit?
I can. This is something that you learn from experience. When we begin to really, lead our church and ministries in this kind of D6 family equipping model, what you begin to realize right away is that there is a misconception out there that what we're after is just trying to build traditional families. And so some people are gun-ho, right? Like that's what we want to do. We got to bring back the traditional family. And here's the reality. Family and homes are important. Just like the church and the home are the two conduits for the gospel, right? But they are not the gospel itself.
Yeah.
And so we've got to be careful about anything that we would try to elevate. We do that all the time in the church, right? And we do that all the time in our lives. We take good things and we try to make them ultimate things. So the ultimate thing biblically is the gospel itself. And if we're not careful, we begin to give a picture that the gospel's only for traditional families, or the gospel's only for a certain kind of home that does certain kinds of things. That's a version of idolatry. And so as it pertains to young adults, we almost create this perception, right? Because you're not married yet, because you're still single, we're gonna put you over here in this little group. As a matter of fact, in my home church, it was literally called the odds and ends class. That's where they put young adults or people who are single, or they just lumped them in this group and they called them odds and ends. And again, it wasn't mean spirited, but it shows how there was a lack of, we don't know what to do with this generation. And so instead, what we want to be sure that we do is yes, we want to elevate the role of the home in disciple making. But one of the things that I argue in the chapter is that we have to help our young adults see that they are not second-class citizens of God's family. They are very much a part of God's family, and we need to welcome them into our homes, into our groups, and into our lives, and into leadership positions in our churches.
In the chapter in Recalibrate, you talk about the need for an intergenerational community that recreates family. Yeah. What does that intergenerational community look like in our churches?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, this is one of those areas where I feel like, just like Deuteronomy 6, right? The way forward is to go back. And so if you go back to even Mark chapter 3, right, there's this radical moment in the ministry of Jesus where he's gathered with his disciples, he's healing, he's teaching, and they come to get him, and his family's quite frankly a little embarrassed by him at this point, because he's, quote, making a scene in Capernaum, and they tell Jesus, hey, Jesus, your mom and your brothers and your sisters are here. And Jesus stops them and says, no, these are my brothers and sisters. And so one of the radical things that Jesus did was he helped us to understand that our homes, our biological families are important, but that once we're in Christ, our commitment is to our church family. And it was a radical teaching for his culture, but it's still an important concept today, because the more the home breaks down, the more and more young adults that emerge from adolescence, into adulthood and have never had a healthy mom, a healthy dad, they've never seen what that looks like. They need to be embraced, and they need spiritual mothers and spiritual fathers. Titus 2 talks about that, the importance of that intergenerational discipleship. And so our churches have to recreate that, and there's such an opportunity and a hunger. One of the interesting things I found in my research for the chapter was this statement: warm is the new cool. what young adults are more interested in than your quote cool church. A lot of churches think, oh, the bar to reach young adults means I have to have a skinny jean wearing worship leader, and we've got to serve lattes in the church lobby and all these things. Listen, of course, every generation has their preference musically, their taste in coffee and food, all these kind of things. They're true, but people assume that if we can't have those things, well, then we can't reach young adults. Well, what young adults are looking for is warmth. Relationally, they want people who are going to see them and embrace them, who are going to mentor them and shepherd them, who are going to see the spiritual gifts in their life and call those out and help them cultivate those things. And so when we do those, we become like family to one another. And that's a really important idea for the church to recapture. I could recommend a resource here by an author by the name of Joseph Hellerman, When Church Was a Family, is an excellent read that dives deep into those biblical passages that I was talking about.
Yeah, earlier you were talking about how that desire to serve is there, but it's not always available in the church. And reading your chapter, you caught my attention when you said that churches are often guilty of only providing, quote, sit and learn opportunities for young adults.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you mean by sit and learn and then what the alternatives could be?
Yeah. Much like when they're young people, we often, this idea, this myth that's out there that young adulthood is extended adolescence. And listen, we all know those examples where there are some young adults who have never matured. And so, yeah, they're guilty of that. But again, that stereotype is not the norm in my experience. Again, part of what's changed my perception on this is I now have 2 young adults. So when we kicked off the D6 conference in 2009, my kids were 8. My oldest one was 8 years old. Well, she's now 20. And so now, as this generation is growing up, we've realized that they've got important things to contribute to the life of the church. And so if we just treat them as extended adolescents, just like we do with children and students, hey, you sit there while I teach you and I give you what you think you want to hear, that kind of mentality. Now, there's a place, obviously, for all of us to sit down with God's word and be humble and be taught, from it. But young adults are fully capable of engaging the mission of the church. A couple of years ago, our church developed a new mission statement. And so it's engaging the whole person with the whole gospel of Jesus Christ. And it's interesting because our young adults are some of the first ones that really latched onto that mission statement, and they get it because, again, they're about the holistic development of the self, and they understand that what we've often preached in our churches has been what I would call a truncated gospel, right? It's a kind of a one-dimensional gospel. When they get it, that the gospel applies to all of life, well, they're hungry to live that out, and so we want to not just have them sit and learn, but we want to empower them to go and not just be disciples, but be disciples who make disciples of others. And so what's interesting is you think missionally, especially, we've got a lot of young people who want to make a difference in the world. And for example, in our church, they're stepping into ministries like they're choosing to live in apartment complexes in Nashville where there are huge numbers of internationals so that they can get to know them and serve them and share the gospel with them. Like that's the kind of flexibility and adaptability that young adults bring. And so we want to encourage that instead of stifle that.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, I want to end by talking about first steps.
Sure.
If a church is looking to engage, or maybe they're trying to re-engage young adults after multiple failed attempts, what should be their first steps to get going?
Yeah, great question. Again, as I mentioned earlier, don't think that you need to start with some big program for young adults. You don't need big buildings, you don't need big budgets or big fancy worship teams. What you need is to commit to mentor the young adults that God has already placed around you. I think the Paul-Timothy dynamic in the New Testament is a great example. You've got Paul, this, elder statesman, gave his life for the gospel, but near the end of his life, he pours more and more into the Timothys and the Tituses. As a matter of fact, his very last letter is 2 Timothy, his most personal letter, in which he calls Timothy his son, in the faith, in which he lays out, principles for godly leadership and what it means to be, have godly character in the church and what it means to guard, the good deposit of the gospel. And so I think that the key is to literally pray with your eyes open. Who are the young adults that God has placed around you who are faithful, who are available, and who are teachable, who are hungry? And I think when you begin small, so to speak, grassroots, you begin to mentor one, you're going to find others, and you build a small group and you engage them and you help them find ways to deepen their faith and to live out their faith. And I think all of a sudden you're going to see the flywheel effect because, again, warm is the new cool, and that's going to attract other like-minded young adults who say, you know what, I don't care what music this church has, I don't care what the pews look like, I don't care what kind of coffee they serve. What I want is to be discipled. And that's the key.
That's really incredible information right there, and really good for us to apply and for us to remember.
And any church can do that,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Any church of any denomination of any size, I think all of us, in that position of leadership can say, who are the Timothys that God has placed around us?
Well, one final question for you. You mentioned that they don't care what kind of coffee is served, but at the beginning I mentioned that you are a fan of strong coffee.
It's true.
So give us your ideal cup of coffee.
Oh, yeah. So black,
Yes.
right? So no, don't dilute the thing with cream or sugar, right? It's nauseating to me. You want the full aroma and the full experience of what God has placed in that coffee bean, right? So taste and see that the Lord is good, and the stronger the cup of coffee, the better the taste. I can go back to literally the best cups of coffee I've ever had are serving on mission journeys, in the hills of Antigua, in Guatemala, looking out at a volcano, sipping a cup of coffee, and they're growing the beans right across the street, or in Kenya, some just amazing places in Nepal with beans that are grown in the Himalayas. I'm serious. Those are the best cups of coffee that I've ever had.
So are you saying that K-cups are an abomination? Is that what I'm
Amen.
hearing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The 11th commandment, right? Thou shalt not use K-cups.
Well, thank you for sharing your coffee insights with us, but thank you for sharing all this other information with us. Like I said, young adults, that's something so dear to me right now. And I just appreciate you sharing your insight and your wisdom with us, whether it's in Recalibrate, whether it's what you're speaking about at the D6 conference, or whether it's just in your ministry. We appreciate it, and thank you so much for being here.
Honored. We love what you guys are doing at D6 and can't wait to see what God's going to do as we continue to invest in every generation.
Are you looking for a way to equip families to do discipleship in their own homes? D6 Everyday offers a new at-home bundle option, so you can reach families where they are. The same great D6 Everyday resources now bundled to fit your family. D6 Everyday at-home bundles are a great way to promote discipleship at home, especially during COVID-19 restrictions. Many churches and small groups are not gathering for worship or discipleship training, but you can resource them with teaching helps for the parents and devotion magazines for every member of the family, or about the cost of a Chick-fil-A meal. For more information, visit d6everyday.com.
Wow, Jay, he communicates so great and just so practically and tangibly. And, he talked a lot about the Paul and Timothy relationship and the mentoring and the discipling relationship and the importance of that. And Ron, my heart for that. That like I live and breathe, the Paul and Timothy relationship in my life. And that's important to me. And, he challenged us at the D6 conference to encourage and to stop and send a text to a young adult in your church. I don't know if you remember this. And he said, let them know that you see them and that you believe in them and you believe in the path that God's laid for them. And I did that. And I want you guys to know that his challenge to us about pursuing those Timothys and being aware of those Timothys, it has started to shape and shift a relationship for me and a trajectory for someone else. So there is power when we pray about and ask God to show us our Timothys.
Agreed. Now, Marianne just said something that might have been a source of jealousy for many of our listeners when they said, oh, our church is filled with this age group. I know that is not the case for a lot of you out there that are listening. And maybe you look around and you have none or one or two. But here's what Jay told us close to the end of the interview. He said, you start with what you have. That's so right. Here's my challenge to you. If you have one young couple, you love on and mentor them and watch that couple grow into 2 or 3 or 4 over time. And you'll hit a tipping point, a Malcolm Gladwell tipping point, and it will begin to flourish. It does not happen overnight, but pour into who God puts around you right now and grow outward from those ages and beyond. I know I'm going to kind of chase a slight rabbit here, Marianne. Jay and I try to get together twice a year. Sometimes we make it, sometimes we don't. We live in the same city. We're friends. We communicate more often than that, but we try to get face to face at least twice a year. And I can almost tell you which restaurant we're going to get face to face at. We both have a favorite Mexican restaurant down closer to where he pastors. But here's what I love about Jay. When we get together, he is a strategist. He's a person who understands the principles from which the programs and the applications flow. He doesn't lead with program. He doesn't go, hey, there's a cool idea another church is doing. Let's borrow it. No, they have a very specific DNA. They have a very specific set of foundations at their church, and it's part of a bigger multi-site church. And when they plant a church, they know that what they're going to plant will have a slightly different culture, but they will never lose their principles of identity. Some pastors have a tough time wrapping their minds around how that works, but Jay is so brilliant at that, and he does it well, and it's somebody you can pattern after. I would recommend you picking up any book that Jay has written, but if you want to dive deeper into this, pick up Recalibrate. It will not only help you with his chapter, but those other 14 authors who were contributing similar style chapters. Recalibrate, a new measure for family ministry. That's the title of it, because if you put that title, just Recalibrate, into Amazon, you're going to get kind of a long list. But Recalibrate, a new measure for family ministry. And you'll find his work. And I know this, you mentioned in a previous podcast, and I know Jay's habits, and what we like when we get together at lunch is we talk about the books we've recently read together, principles we draw from it, and we encourage one another about what trends we're seeing. I want to challenge our listeners in here to make sure they're reading on a regular basis, at least one book a month, if not more, and talking about that book with somebody else. So don't read in isolation. Read with a friend, an accountability person, or just somebody else going through the same area that you want to learn about, whether it's young adult ministry or family ministry or leadership, whatever your topic, grab somebody else and discuss it. I'm part of a group of men who we meet every Tuesday night from 9 to 10 on Zoom. We've been doing it for about 3 or 4 years for accountability, encouragement, sharing, but we're always reading a book in the background and talking about it. And it's not always about the book. It's the jumping off point to the application of life. We need those areas. So Jay, thank you for being one of those guys in my life that makes me stronger, makes me sharper. And thank you for being on the front lines, just literally making a difference in the local church and mentoring other pastors around the country who are watching what you're doing. Well, until next week, we're going to challenge you with those same principles. Read, find a Timothy, encourage that young adult ministry, and see what God puts in your lap when you begin to cultivate it. Until next week, we're praying for you. You take care.
You've been listening to the D6 Podcast. You can learn more about D6 at d6family.com.